All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be digging into some fascinating material that focuses on a really crucial topic.
Yeah, for sure.
You brought us some excerpts from a document called CHH1, The War Within.pdf.
Right.
And this text dives into the experience of veterans, transitioning back to civilian life.
Yep.
And our goal today is to really get under the skin of that, the key challenges that veterans face and maybe unpack some potential ways forward, based on what we see in this chapter. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great goal. This deep dive is really going to try to help us understand this transition that often goes much deeper than just, changing careers.
Right.
It involves, a fundamental reshaping of who you are and how you see the world and navigate this new world, really.
Yeah, and I mean, right off the bat, one of the things that this document, shines a light on, I think, is that shift, from that highly structured environment, of military life to the relative freedom, or maybe even the void of structure. Right.
In the civilian world. And I think, speaking for myself, I'm a civilian, I've never served. It's really easy to underestimate how deeply ingrained that structure becomes.
Yeah.
We think about the military, we think about schedules, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah, it really is. It goes way beyond just, when you wake up and when you eat. It's about clearly defined roles. It's about knowing who's in charge, who you report to. That chain of command is so clear and really, kind of comforting in a way. You know what to expect. There's a predictable rhythm to the day. And I think that fosters a really, really powerful sense of order and certainty in a world that can often feel very chaotic.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And then,
Right.
When that's gone, according to this text, it can be so disorienting. I mean, everything changes, pretty abruptly when you transition out.
Yeah.
And, you go from these rigid routines and clear responsibilities to, well, what can feel like, a lack of structure.
And even just a sense of unpredictability in everyday life. And I think it's easy to see how that could leave veterans feeling really disconnected, uncertain about, even just how to navigate the world around them, right? It's not even about, just missing a routine. It seems like that structure really provided this fundamental sense of like how to be
Absolutely.
in the world. Like without it, it's like you're navigating a new landscape, but you don't have a map.
That's such a great analogy. And the document really emphasizes that, for many veterans, this transition brings a really profound sense of loss. The military, it's not just a job.
Right.
It's a community. It's a way of life. And it really shapes who you are at your core.
Yeah, that's such a crucial point. You're not just leaving a job, you're stepping away from a huge part of who you are, your identity. And the author, talks about how hard it was to figure out, who they were in their personal life. After they took off the uniform, they lost their rank, and there was no longer that daily camaraderie. They even say, that it can be scary and deep to lose your identity.
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement. And that's something that, we really need to understand, as civilians and as a society. This isn't a superficial adjustment. The military experience creates a very strong sense of self, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging.
Absolutely.
And redefining yourself without those things is a huge personal journey. The text highlights it involves, trying new things, exploring new interests, rethinking what gives your life meaning now.
Yeah. And that sense of brotherhood, right? That camaraderie, it's not something you can easily find in civilian life. And the text points out that building those new meaningful relationships, it takes time, it takes work, it takes effort.
Yeah, a lot of effort.
It's a void that a lot of veterans experience, and it's understandable, when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that social support is so vital, for anyone's well-being. So, this transition isn't just an individual process. It's about coming back into a different social environment.
Right. Yeah, and from that kind of external shift in structure and identity, the document then moves into what it calls the emotional and mental shift. And, it describes that as being a really considerable hurdle. And, it makes it clear that veterans often carry, deep emotional scars and psychological effects that might not even be visible, to others.
Right.
And so, when we talk about that, what's really important to recognize here, based on this text, is that the challenges don't just vanish, right, when the deployment ends. Veterans have often encountered, such intense trauma, grief, and these really complex emotions like survivor's guilt.
Right.
And, these aren't just fleeting feelings. I mean, they can really manifest, as serious mental health challenges like PTSD, which can develop after someone experiences or witnesses a terrifying event.
Yeah.
Um, and, as well as things like depression and anxiety.
Absolutely.
And the author shares this really impactful personal insight. He says, the battlefield moved from the real risks of Afghanistan to the just as difficult places in my mind. And, when I read that, I thought that's such a powerful way to kind of bring home that invisible nature, of these wounds.
It really is. And, the text goes on to illustrate, how these memories, the sounds of gunfire, the images of battle, the loss of comrades, it can all come back so unexpectedly.
Mm-hmm.
And it can turn, ordinary everyday events into these triggers.
Yeah.
And it creates this feeling like you're always on edge.
Yeah. And there's that phrase that really stuck with me, like walking through a trap, and I thought that really captures that tension, that you're living with, that underlying tension and that feeling of unpredictability.
Absolutely.
When those memories might strike. And, the document makes it clear that overcoming these internal battles, it's not just about time passing or willpower.
Right.
It really demands this active engagement, a focused effort to heal. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And, the text mentions things like therapy, support groups, and mindfulness as being really vital tools for healing and learning to live with these past experiences. And, it's not about erasing those memories. It's about finding a way to make them part of your life without them controlling you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so reintegration, in this context, it's not about forgetting the past. It's about learning to live well in the present, despite those experiences, right?
Right.
And that actually leads really nicely into the next section, which introduces this idea of the battlefield of the mind. And it presents mindfulness as this crucial compass.
Right.
So when we talk about mindfulness, can we maybe define that for people listening who might not be familiar with the term?
Yeah, absolutely. So mindfulness is really about paying attention to the present moment without judging yourself for what you're feeling or thinking. It's about becoming more aware of what's happening inside you, like your thoughts, your emotions, your body sensations. It's about being present with your experience without trying to change it or push it away.
Okay, so it's not just about, like meditation or something.
It can be, but it's broader than that.
Okay.
It's a way of being, a way of approaching life.
Yeah, and I see here the text specifically points out that it introduces mindfulness practices that are, geared towards veterans, right?
Yes.
Things like PTSD, anxiety, depression. It emphasizes that, the chapter gives practical step-by-step guidance on how to actually use these techniques.
Right. And that's really important because it's not just about these vague ideas. It's about giving veterans actual tools that they can use to manage those intrusive thoughts, those really difficult emotions, and help them to feel calmer and more in control of their lives.
Yeah. And it's not just about managing those difficult aspects, right?
Right.
The document also highlights the importance of self-compassion and acceptance through mindfulness. So it's about, recognizing your experiences and treating yourself with kindness throughout this process.
Yeah, I think that's really key because often, veterans can be really hard on themselves. They blame themselves. They judge themselves. And mindfulness offers a way to be more accepting and understanding of your own thoughts and feelings.
Mm-hmm. I like, too, how the text really reframes the emotional journey, right? So it encourages veterans to see this not as a return to normal, but as an opportunity, right, to discover strengths and insights within themselves. It's kind of a powerful way to look at it.
It's not just about going back. It's about growing from what you've been through.
Yeah. And then, I noticed that the document even calls chapter 1.2, navigating emotional and psychological terrain. It calls that a map and a beacon, which I thought was kind of a cool way to describe it. It emphasizes the empowerment that comes from, actively taking control of your mental health.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's about realizing that you have the power to shape your own healing journey. You're not just a victim of circumstance.
Yeah. So moving on from that, the deep dive then goes into talking about reintegrating into family and society, right? Yeah. And it points out that these connections have obviously evolved, while the veteran was serving.
Yeah.
And so what kinds of challenges can arise, when you come back to this changed landscape?
Well, while the veteran has been away, life at home has continued. Roles within the family may have shifted. The things that everyone used to connect over, those shared experiences, well, they might feel really distant now. And so, Veterans might return and find that their place has changed and that those relationships with loved ones, whether it's their spouse, their children, their friends, those relationships have changed in ways that can be both big and small.
And that must be really unsettling, to come back and not quite feel like you fit in anymore.
Yeah, it can lead to a real sense of separation. The author describes it as feeling like they'd changed in ways that were hard to explain, sometimes even impossible to share with their loved ones. They talk about feeling like there's this invisible wall between them and their family.
That image of an invisible wall really stuck with me too. It's like you can't truly communicate the depth of your experiences, almost like you're speaking a different language. And I can imagine that must be very isolating, even when you're surrounded by people who love you.
It really is. It highlights that gap in understanding that can develop, because loved ones haven't shared those intense experiences.
Yeah.
So it can be really hard for them to fully grasp what the veteran is going through.
Right. And the document emphasizes that, repairing these relationships, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a willingness to understand and adapt from both sides, right? It's not just on the veteran to readjust.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. It requires empathy and a willingness to learn from each other's experiences, both during and after deployment.
Yeah, it's about finding that common ground again, building new shared experiences, and acknowledging, that the veteran has become a different person in some ways.
Exactly. It's about adapting to a new dynamic, accepting the changes that have happened on both sides.
So the next big challenge that the deep dive tackles is this idea of finding purpose and direction, right, after you leave the military. And it explains that, the military provides this incredibly strong sense of purpose and role, right?
Yeah, I mean, that sense of mission is so central to the military experience.
Yeah.
It gives you a clear reason for doing what you do, and it feels like you're contributing to something much bigger than yourself.
And when that's gone, when you're back in the civilian world, the text explains that it can leave this huge void, right?
Right.
Because, the civilian world doesn't always offer those same clear-cut paths or that same sense of duty.
Right.
So that can leave veterans feeling really lost, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like being set adrift without a compass. The
Yeah.
next steps aren't always obvious, and it can be a really difficult and confusing time.
And so the author talks about their own experience with this, going through this process of self-reflection. And they were asking themselves these questions, what do I really care about? What am I good at? What does success and happiness even mean to me now that I'm outside of the military?
Yeah.
So it's like this period of really deep questioning.
It really is. It's about figuring out what truly motivates you now, what your values are, what you want to strive for in this new chapter of your life.
Right. And the document, emphasizes the need to reevaluate personal goals and values. And it suggests things like education, new careers, volunteering, or finding ways to use your military skills in a civilian context. It describes it as this journey of self-discovery, figuring out what's important in civilian life, what resonates with you.
It's about taking all of that discipline, the skills, the resilience that you honed in the military, and applying them in new ways that feel meaningful to you.
Yeah.
It's about translating those assets into a new context.
And it highlights the importance of, being open to new experiences while still valuing, what you gain during your service. It's not about throwing away the past.
Yeah, it's about building on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on, the deep dive then describes the ordinary world, life beyond service, right? And it kind of paints this picture of the transition as this major turning point, You're moving from this world of order and danger to something that feels more, I guess, normal.
Yeah, and they use this analogy of going through a door into a different world.
Yeah.
Which I think really captures that sense of stepping into a reality with a completely different set of rules.
Yeah, and the text explains, that in the military, things are very predictable, right? But in civilian life, you're suddenly making your own choices. You don't have someone telling you what to do all the time. And that freedom, it can be exciting, but it can also be confusing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be really overwhelming at first because you're so used to having that clear structure and direction.
Right. And the document also talks about the need to redefine yourself, outside of that military framework of your job and your responsibilities. Like your role in the service was such a big part of who you were. So losing that requires you to kind of go through this internal process, right, of sorting through your experiences and your values to build a new sense of self.
Yeah, it's about understanding who you are beyond that uniform, beyond that rank. It's about figuring out what your values are in this new context.
And then the text also mentions, learning to navigate the complexities of civilian life. And it points out that things are often much less black and white than they were in the military. There's a lot more nuance.
Right.
And it talks about the need to find meaning in everyday interactions and the patience that it takes to adjust to this new rhythm of life.
It's about finding purpose in the smaller things, in the everyday moments that might have seemed less significant when you were in a high-stakes environment.
Yeah. And that leads to this section on rebuilding life, challenges and realizations.
Right.
And it talks about this as a multifaceted journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
That starts with practical things like finding a job and a place to live.
Mm-hmm.
But then it really quickly moves into the deeper personal adjustments that have to be made.
Yeah, and what I find really insightful here is the point they make that while those practical steps are necessary, the real work, the most important part of rebuilding your life, happens inside your own head.
And the text, brings up again how deeply military culture shapes how you see yourself.
Right.
And so losing that clear identity when you leave can be really challenging.
It is, because it forces you to question everything you thought you knew about yourself.
And so it emphasizes this need for self-reflection and a willingness to redefine who you are now. And it also talks about the difficulties of connecting with civilians, people who haven't shared those military experiences. It mentions feeling uncomfortable in conversations that used to feel familiar, and it talks about that sense of disconnection again, that unseen wall.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's always an unseen wall, or are there sometimes real differences in perspective that make it hard to connect?
I think it's both. That feeling of separation can be internal. So in a way, it is unseen, but it's often rooted in very real differences in how you see the world.
Yeah.
Veterans have lived through things and developed perspectives that civilians might not fully understand, and vice versa.
Right, right. And that can create these very real communication barriers, right? It's that feeling of not being truly understood.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the document emphasizes, how hard it can be to share those traumatic experiences without pushing people away. But at the same time, you're trying to understand what their lives were like while you were gone. And it makes it clear that rebuilding those relationships, it takes effort from everyone involved.
Yeah, it's a two-way street. It requires empathy and a willingness to learn about each other's experiences, both during and after deployment.
Yeah. So the next section is about finding a new sense of normal, right? And it talks about this as being a really crucial but also very difficult part of reintegration because it involves accepting the changes that have happened, and accepting that you're different now than you were before you served.
Mm-hmm. And that acceptance is really key. It's about acknowledging that you've been changed by your experiences and integrating that into who you are now.
The document emphasizes, that this is a gradual process. It takes time, it takes understanding, and it takes a willingness to adapt and grow.
It really is a process of evolution. It's not just about snapping back to who you were before. It's about figuring out who you are now, what your priorities are, and what brings you fulfillment in this new chapter of your life.
And it also mentions the need to, step outside of your comfort zone, to try new things, whether it's education, a new career, or hobbies, right?
Or it's about actively creating that new normal rather than waiting for it to happen.
And importantly, it acknowledges that this process often involves dealing with social and mental health challenges like PTSD and anxiety. It makes it clear that, working through those challenges is a big part of creating this new sense of normalcy.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that those challenges are real, they're valid, and addressing them is essential for moving forward.
And the text highlights the importance of professional help, therapy, for example, to help manage symptoms and process those difficult experiences.
Right. And it also talks about the value of support groups, because connecting with other veterans who understand what you're going through can be so powerful.
Yeah.
It reminds you that you're not alone.
Right. And then the document also points to the benefits of mindfulness, meditation, and self-care practices, for staying present, managing stress, understanding yourself better, and finding some inner peace. It really frames those practices as essential, not just for surviving, but for thriving.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. These practices aren't just about getting by. They're about empowering you to live a fulfilling life.
Right. So moving on, the deep dive then really focuses in on unmasking the scars, the psychological impacts of service.
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes, how deeply and for how long military service can affect mental health. It stresses that these effects are often invisible, but they're just as real and harmful as physical injuries.
Right. And this section does a really good job of highlighting those hidden wounds of war, those mental and emotional scars that might not be visible to others, but that are just as debilitating.
And I think one of the things that makes it so challenging is that, physical injuries are visible, right?
Hmm.
But these emotional wounds, they're hidden. And that can make them harder to understand, harder to validate, both for the veteran and for the people around them.
Absolutely. And the text points out that these psychological effects can last a lifetime. They can impact so many areas of a veteran's life through intrusive memories, nightmares, and this constant feeling of unease.
The author, talks about their own struggle with those past memories, how everyday things could trigger these really strong reactions, and how that made them feel stuck between two worlds.
Yeah, that feeling of being caught between the past and the present is so common for veterans dealing with trauma. It makes it really difficult to fully engage with civilian life.
The text emphasizes, how hard it can be to address these hidden wounds, and it stresses the need to acknowledge them and to proactively seek help and develop coping mechanisms.
It's about realizing that these wounds are real, that they deserve attention, and that healing is possible.
And it also talks about the stigma surrounding mental health, right?
Right.
Both in the military and in civilian life, which it can be a huge barrier to getting help. It makes this really crucial point, that admitting you're struggling is not a weakness, it's actually a strength.
Hmm.
And that recognizing these mental and emotional effects as real injuries is the first step towards recovery.
Yeah, it's about changing the narrative around mental health, destigmatizing it, and creating a culture where seeking help is seen as a sign of strength and self-care.
So the next section dives into the spectrum of psychological challenges, and it really outlines the wide range of mental health problems that veterans can face, not just PTSD.
Right, and it's important to understand that PTSD is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
The text also talks about depression, which is characterized by feelings of hopelessness and sadness and anxiety disorders, which can involve constant worry and fear.
And the author, talks about their own experience during their transition. They describe this feeling of constant worry, periods of depression, and those intrusive memories that would keep them from sleeping. It really gives you a sense of the toll that this takes, on a person's life.
It really does.
And again, the text brings up that stigma around mental health and that reluctance that a lot of soldiers, including the author, felt about seeking help because they saw it as a weakness.
Right, and that's a common perception in the military, where strength and self-reliance are so highly valued.
Yeah. And it highlights that turning point, where the author overcame that stigma and realized that getting help was actually a sign of strength, not weakness.
Yeah, that's a really important shift in perspective.
And it emphasizes the importance of professional treatment, things like individual and group counseling, to help manage symptoms and process those experiences. It also mentions that medication can be a helpful part of treatment for some people.
Right. And it's about finding what works best for each individual because there's no one-size-fits-all approach to mental health care.
Right, right. So moving on, the deep dive explores this idea of the weight of silence, addressing unspoken traumas. And it talks about how silence, while it might feel protective at first, can actually make things worse in the long run.
Yeah, it's like trying to bury something deep down and hoping it will go away.
Yeah.
But often it just festers and grows stronger in the darkness.
The document emphasizes that talking about those traumas, even though it's hard, is essential for healing. And it acknowledges how difficult it can be to put those feelings and memories into words, and that fear of being judged or misunderstood.
The author shares their own struggle with this, the difficulty of articulating those experiences and the fear of being judged.
Yeah.
And I think that resonates with a lot of veterans. It can feel so vulnerable to open up about those things.
And the text describes it so well. It talks about how memories of battle and loss and that constant feeling of being on high alert, it casts these long, heavy shadows on everyday life. And that silence becomes this constant reminder, right, of the underlying stress.
It's like carrying a heavy weight around all the time.
Yeah. And so the document really highlights the courage that it takes to confront that inner turmoil and to accept those painful experiences as part of your story.
Right. It's about realizing that those experiences don't define you, but they are a part of you. And acknowledging them is part of the healing process.
And it emphasizes that sharing those stories, with the support of therapists or other veterans who understand, can help you move away from that silence towards a place of understanding and support.
It's about finding your voice again and realizing that you don't have to go through this alone.
So the next section talks about the impact of unaddressed trauma and goes into detail about the long-lasting effects of unresolved stress. Things like feeling emotionally numb, isolating yourself, behaving in negative ways, and having trouble with relationships.
Yeah, and unresolved trauma can have this ripple effect. It can impact every area of your life.
The document explains that avoiding those issues can lead to feeling overwhelmed, like you're carrying this burden that's just too heavy. And that can make feelings of sadness and anxiety even worse.
It's like trying to hold your breath for too long. Eventually you have to come up for air.
They also talks about their own experience, how the longer they avoided talking about what they'd been through, the heavier that burden became, and how it affected their mental health and their ability to readjust to civilian life.
Yeah, and that's a common experience. The longer you try to suppress those feelings and memories, the more power they have over you.
And the text emphasizes that recognizing those experiences and how they're affecting you is that first step towards healing. You can't address something you don't acknowledge.
Exactly. It's about bringing those things out into the light where you can start to process them and heal.
And it reiterates, the importance of getting professional help, like therapy, to provide a safe space to process those emotions and to make sense of what happened. It also talks about the value of connecting with other veterans, for support and understanding.
That peer support can be so valuable
Yeah.
because it comes from people who truly get it, who have walked in your shoes.
Yeah. And the document ends this section by saying that breaking the silence, getting professional help, and building supportive relationships are the keys to overcoming those past traumas and finding peace and happiness.
It's a message of hope and empowerment,
Mhm.
that healing is possible and that there are things you can do to move forward.
Right, right. And then the deep dive introduces this concept of meeting the mentor, expert insights and guidance, and it presents this as a potential turning point in the healing process.
Yeah, and I think the role of a mentor, whether it's a therapist or another veteran who's been there, can be incredibly powerful.
Hmm.
They bring this deep understanding and specialized knowledge that can be so helpful.
The author talks about meeting a therapist who specialized in working with veterans and how that was a real turning point for them.
Right, and it highlights the importance of finding someone who really gets it, who understands the unique challenges that veterans face.
And the author, was honest about their initial hesitation, those feelings of pride and doubt about going to therapy, especially with someone who hadn't served. And that fear of opening up, to a stranger about such personal things.
Yeah, I think that's really common, especially in military culture where self-reliance is so emphasized, it can feel really vulnerable to ask for help.
And the text mentions that hearing from other veterans who had benefited from therapy was a big factor in their decision to finally reach out for help.
Yeah, I think that peer support can be so important in overcoming that stigma and realizing that getting help is actually a sign of strength.
Right, right. And then it emphasizes how important it was that those first therapy sessions felt safe and non-judgmental, that it created a space where they could start to explore those difficult experiences.
Yeah, that feeling of being truly heard and understood is so essential for building trust and allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
And the text talks about the therapist's expertise in working with veterans and how that provided both comfort and really helpful guidance. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach. It was tailored to the author's specific needs.
Right, and that's what good therapy should be. It should be individualized and focused on the specific needs and experiences of the person seeking help.
And it mentions the different therapeutic methods that were used, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which helps you identify and change negative thought patterns, and exposure therapy, which involves gradually confronting those traumatic memories in a safe environment.
Right, and those are both evidence-based therapies that have been proven to be effective for treating trauma and PTSD.
The author talks about how the therapist was able to connect with them and their struggles and offer guidance that helped them understand things about their experience that they hadn't been able to grasp before.
And that's the power of therapy. It can help you make sense of things that feel chaotic and overwhelming.
So the section concludes by saying that the mentor's advice and support were crucial in navigating that transition and giving the author the tools to build a new life. It really underscores the value of having that expert guidance.
Yeah, it highlights how transformative it can be to have someone who understands what you're going through, who can offer support and guidance along the way.
Right. And then the deep dive go into more detail about the impact of specialized therapy and support.
Yeah.
And it really breaks down the different techniques that were used in the author's healing process.
Yeah.
It mentions cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, mindfulness, and relaxation techniques for managing anxiety and stress.
It's a really comprehensive approach that addresses both the psychological and the physical aspects of healing.
And it also mentions the therapist's encouragement to join veteran support groups, to reconnect with that sense of camaraderie and belonging that can be so hard to find after leaving the military.
Right, and that social support can be so crucial for healing and feeling connected.
And the text points out that the therapist support went beyond the therapy sessions. They provided resources like books, stress reduction exercises, and emotional regulation techniques.
Yeah, it's about creating a whole support system that extends beyond those formal sessions.
And it talks about the role of the therapist in helping the author set realistic goals for themselves, both personally and professionally.
Yeah.
Giving them that direction that they might have been missing.
That sense of purpose and direction can be really grounding during a time of transition.
The section ends by emphasizing how important this holistic approach was for the author and how that expert guidance really helped them create a healthier and more fulfilling life after service.
It's a powerful message, that healing is possible and that seeking out expert support can make a huge difference.
Right. So finally, the deep dive.